everyone hated this show or even just skipped out on it, let's talk about The Acolyte. The Acolyte is the Disney Plus Star Wars series, the most recent one that just came out, and you probably already heard about it. You probably heard all the awful things that people are saying about this show. Now, some of the things were a little too exaggerated. Some of the things that they say about the show are just nonsense. A lot of people are attacking the cast, but The Acolyte failed for multiple reasons. And all of them could have really been prevented. Because the reality of The Acolyte is that there was a lot of great ideas here. Actual great characters that got introduced. However, all these issues caused The Acolyte to fail. Reason number one, the dialogue. The dialogue of The Acolyte is very weak. I've seen these actors in other movies, and the dialogue just did not serve to their strengths. The dialogue of the show may throw people off when great stuff happens in the show, which is a shame, because again, I'll get into what were the great things about The Acolyte. The second thing that caused The Acolyte to fail was just the way they went about the Force. The Force is a very delicate thing that has been established across multiple films. And I don't want to get super nerdy, but I will. The Force is not something you see. You never see a Force push. You never actually see the Force. You just see it happen. And in this show, they showed it. Like there was a visual for it. That's not okay. The whole point of the Force is that you can't see it. Which is why characters like Han Solo are very interesting, because he's like, until I see it, I'll believe it. And if you can see the Force, it defeats that purpose. And not only that, the whole witches part of the series was just not the best. I feel like it could have been much more condensed. I don't think it was necessary to have them do the things they did. In the show, two witches make life using the Force. Kind of like what Anakin experienced through. Anakin Skywalker was a character that was made through the Force, which is one of the big things that made him very important. Now, if they wanted to do that in this show, they needed to go about it very differently, because it just didn't work. It did not serve as the Force. It did not add to the lore. I personally, if you could have just taken that out, I would have done that in the first place. But let's say you can't. Let's say you have to keep it in. I would maybe play into the narrative that someone taught the witches how to do that in exchange for something. And that someone could be Darth Plagueis. Now, you don't say that, obviously. You keep that as a mystery, but you keep fans in their toes and you actually add more intrigue to that. Maybe if the witches said there's an ancient Force wielder who taught them how to do that, but it comes at a cost, which would actually add more stakes to the twins, Osha and May, to stay with them. Because what if part of the deal for them to make them was to eventually give them to Darth Plagueis? Which is why it's a big no-no when the Jedi come to get them. Because that way, that can be Darth Plagueis' first attempt at trying to create life. And maybe if Osha and May have some defect that is not perfect, could add more lore to it. Like Darth Plagueis didn't get it right the first time. So when he tries it on Anakin, it's perfect. The prophecy is fulfilled. That's a lot to cover in an 8-episode series. So I honestly would have just gone without it. But if you need to include that part, that would be my suggestion in how to do that. Now, the third part is definitely the pacing of this show. The pacing of the show was very slow. Now, my viewing experience wasn't as bad as everyone's is, because I started watching the show when there were already 5 episodes out. And the last episode I saw was episode 5, which was the best episode. There were things that you could have easily cut out. And some things you could have honestly condensed. That whole witch portion could have easily been condensed. Both episodes could have been 1 episode, in my opinion. And obviously you gotta play with the narrative a little bit differently. But the mystery was drawn out way too long. And that's another thing. When we spend time with very well-crafted characters like Ymir and Soul, we build them up. We get great moments, and then the show decides, Actually, we're going to take a time out and return to this other narrative. I honestly think this should have been a show about Sol and Kimir, or even more so, Kimir. Kimir was one of the most interesting characters that they introduced, and having him be at the centerfold would have been much more interesting. Maybe you start the narrative with Sol, and you see his sin, and you know that from the get-go. So when you see May and Osha, you're like, when are they gonna find out? That you don't need to draw it out. You add more tension. So when the May and Osha parts come in, this whole time you're thinking, when are they gonna find out? What their reaction is gonna be, and adds to a more powerful ending to the end result that we get to see at the show. And that is all just the pacing, the structure of the show. So let me get into the great stuff about the show. Sol and Kimir, two incredible characters that were introduced. Master Sol reminded me a lot about Qui-Gon Jinn. I really loved that. The fact that we see another Jedi who doesn't really like the way the Jedi Council is ran. I love to see that. Now, Kimir was a character that was full of intrigue, a very well-crafted villain. There was so much mystery about him. When I say I wanted to spend more time with him, it's not to uncover more mystery and get rid of the mysterious aura he has, but rather see more of that mysterious aura play out and affect the narrative. Because I think we didn't see enough of him. He could have honestly been the main character. It would have been interesting to see him kind of have, like, the reason he probably is looking for an acolyte is because he probably had a falling out with Darth Plagueis. So it would have been interesting, or maybe he didn't. Maybe he didn't have a falling out with Darth Plagueis, and this is just part of his training to train someone else to become a Sith. I mean, you can go about it many different ways. He has a falling out with Darth Plagueis, or Darth Plagueis told him, get an apprentice. There's multiple ways, and I'm not saying make Darth Plagueis a character. I don't think this was the show for him to be a main prominent character. Or, and again, maybe it focuses on Sol. I don't think we really need to spend that much time with the witches and learn about them because it really didn't add to the story. And when we get to the first murder, that could be episode 2. That adds more stakes to it because in the back of your head, you're thinking there is a sin committed and no one knows about it except the Jedi. Again, not all of this is like bare bones ideas because I really enjoyed a lot in this show. I finished it because it was worth watching, but it's hard to recommend because there's so many things that are wrong with it that it could just throw you off and just honestly prevent you from finishing the show. Like, I was fortunate that I got to binge the first 5 episodes, so never once there were like pacing issues for me. But now looking back at it, if I had to watch episode 1 and then wait a week, it's just nothing much happened in episode 1 and not much happened in episode 2. And then by the time we get to episode 5, everything comes together. But did it really need to take 5 episodes to get to the best episode? And then the show, it's kind of like the show goes like this, up, and then flatlines a little bit like that. Which brings me to the episode 5 that I keep talking about. I think that was one of the best episodes that I've seen TV Star Wars put out, mainly because of its choreography. The Acolyte had a great balance of CGI effects and great choreography. I think a lot more shows should follow this example because the fight scenes were incredible. I really enjoyed it. And the last episode has a great fight sequence, but it unfortunately ends very anticlimactic in my opinion because we didn't really build up to that moment well. It kind of all happened too sudden. And then there were just too many plot holes to wrap this whole thing up. And that is why I think The Acolyte failed, despite having so many great ideas, so many great characters, and honestly a cast that tried to give it their all. We'll see what happens if there's a second Acolyte season. It's very unlikely there will, but we'll see what Disney thinks. Because after all, this show did get kind of like decent views. Not great to guarantee a second season, but decent.